wanted to file a writ against my neighbor because his cow broke my fence or whatever and I want to sue him. Well, you got to pay the crown just for the privilege of doing that. But British citizens didn't. Citizens in England did not pay that. The Quartering Act authorized the British Army to take over private businesses and residences to house soldiers and officers. Can you imagine that? You're sitting in your home and 20 soldiers just come in and say, "Get out, this is our house now." Are you going to be that happy with George III? Many state delegates, let me back up a little bit. What that did was put this feeling of hatred against the crown because they felt like they had no recourse. They weren't listening. George III basically decided that these people were all serfs. The colonists were less than British citizens, even though most of them were born in England or they were first generation American. That's just a brief little show of the different acts and taxes that the king put on the colonists that made them want to start thinking about rebelling and seceding from the empire. Moving on to after the Constitution was ratified. We're jumping around a little bit because it's a lot of info. Moving on to after the Constitution was ratified, many of the state delegates wanted the Constitution to document the protection of rights guaranteed to the individual. Now, why did they want that? They were still terrified of the idea of a big, powerful central government like they had just fought for 10 years, coming in and running them again. They were terrified of it, every one of them. This was a common conversation on the streets, if you can imagine that, discussing the Constitution on a daily basis with your friends and neighbors, debating Article 1, debating Article 2. Well, should we do this? Should the legislature have this many people? It was quite an interesting time back then. They were all heavily engaged in their government because they had just fought and died for it. Most of the people that signed the Declaration of Independence at the end of the war were either dead or bankrupt. Everyone that lived in the colonies knew someone or was related to someone that died in battle fighting this war for their own freedom. Even though less than 50% of the population actually participated in the war in any way. So the states were very nervous, the state delegates were very nervous because their constituents at home, they listened to them at that time, were kept saying, "We don't want this federal government, we don't want it." They had started with the Articles of Confederation, thought it was a great, some of them thought it was a great idea because it was so decentralized, but it turned out to be, they couldn't do anything with it. Just little small revolts like Shays' Rebellion that almost brought down the government. They had to make it a little stronger and a little more centralized. A lot of people were against the Constitution in the first place. Thomas Jefferson, for example, he boycotted it. He wanted nothing to do with the Constitution. He had gone to France as an ambassador, was in France during the ratification of the Constitution, and had no interest in it. In fact, he was totally against it. James Madison and him were good friends. They were talking back and forth via letters the whole time. Once the Constitution got passed and ratified, Jefferson started lobbying Madison for a Bill of Rights like they had in the state of Virginia, colony of Virginia, to try to protect individual rights more from this all-encompassing federal government. Madison didn't initially like that idea. He felt that it was pointless, it was a waste of time, because in his mind, this was just common sense. Of course you have the right to bear arms to defend yourself. Of course you have the freedom of speech. Why do we even need to write that down? Thank God they did, right? Because at the time the Constitution was nothing but, this is the nuts and bolts of how the federal government worked. It didn't have anything blockading the federal government enough from the individual, mainly just from the states. Jefferson's lobbying Madison, though, was fruitful, and luckily Madison, being the brilliant man that he was primarily responsible for the Bill of Rights. Him, and there was a committee, but all of them on the committee basically said, no, he's the brainchild of all this. He brought all this together. So we can thank Madison for our Bill of Rights and for the battle we've got going on right now over them. The amendments were debated and agreed upon in order to cement the Continental Congress's delegate support for the Constitution. That was the other thing. It was kind of like what they did with the health care bill, but in a different way. They said, look, let's get the Constitution ratified, let's get moving forward, and we'll work on the Bill of Rights together, but first we got to get a government running. Kind of like they did with the health care bill. Look, let's get this going, and then we'll change some things afterwards. But at least they were all involved in the actual debate and discussion. So let's go on. Let's start at number 1 with the First Amendment. I can't read that. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Well, let's take this in small chunks here, because this is the big one. The first part, freedom of religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, all over, mainly because a lot of people want to get rid of original intent. If you go by original intent, there's nothing to debate. The origins of this bill, of this piece of the First Amendment, freedom of religion. England and many other European countries had a state religion that the people were required to tithe to. Denmark still does. You're required to tithe 10% of your income as a tax to the state religion in Denmark. Many Americans fled Europe in order to free themselves from religious persecution by their government. William Penn, in the late 1600s, he was arrested in England for preaching out in the town square. They had told him, you can't go in any building and preach, so he stood out in the street. And so people started listening, so they came and hustled him off and arrested him. That's why he came to America in the first place and founded Pennsylvania. The colonies were made of many different religions, mostly the different Protestant churches. They didn't get along. You have splinters of Baptists and splinters of Methodists now, and you can imagine what it was like then. The Methodists thought the Baptists were the devil's own son. Kind of strange nowadays, but back then, they didn't like each other at all. But many liberals want to attempt to paint Jefferson and Madison as deists, almost atheists, and not religious men. But these two men are primarily responsible for the First Amendment to the Constitution with their correspondence back and forth when Jefferson was in France. Jefferson's letter of response to the Danbury Baptists in 1802. Jefferson was president then. He was the third president of the United States. Have any of y'all heard of this letter? No. Okay. What it was there was a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, and they were not being treated very well by the state. The state of Connecticut had a very wishy-washy law. Their constitution at the time, they could interpret it as, you know, the government just decides you Baptists don't need to worship here. It was very weak as far as protection from the state. They were actually talking at the time about having a state religion in Connecticut and requiring people to tithe to it, just like they were doing in England. The Danbury Baptists, when Jefferson got elected, they thought it was fantastic. They thought Jefferson was one of them in that he was a true believer in separation of church and state. But we have to look at this from the context of the time, not the context of now. Just because someone says a wall of separation between church and state does not mean removal of religion from the country. Not in the context that they thought of it at the time when it was written. Taken in context of the letter from the Baptists, it is obvious Jefferson was calming their fears that the government would not one day take back their right to religious freedom. What the liberals like to do is take one sentence in a letter that the President of the United States wrote in 1802. The letter's one page. It's like 2 paragraphs. They like to take that one sentence and decide that all religion should be banned from all public places. Ridiculous. It's not in the Constitution. It's not original intent. If you look at it from the context of the time, you have to take the context of the entire letter that Jefferson wrote and look at it from the context of what the Danbury Baptists were asking him. That's the part they leave out when they talk about this.